There's one skill that all successful professional poker players possess. It doesn't matter if they play cash or MTTs, full ring or heads up, or are GTO or exploitative. They all have the ability to accurately construct ranges. That is, they're able to fluently assess the most likely hands in their opponent's range and their own range, and then make probabilistic decisions that maximize their EV based on those ranges. This indisputable fact raises an obvious question. If this skill is so important, how does one go about developing it? Well, traditionally, the only way to learn range construction was to play many hands against many different people and accumulate a mental database for how opponents typically play in common spots. Then solvers were invented, which allowed users to standardize and rapidly develop their range construction skills because they finally had objective, visual data of the perfect strategy which they could break down and analyze. Solver solutions were then gamified and turned into GTO trainers, which allowed for repetitive drilling. These tools, which are now ubiquitous, have significantly advanced poker learning. However, these tools, though great, are not perfect. Although solvers can show us what the optimal strategies look like, they only offer passive learning, which often results in a superficial understanding of the subject matter. And GTO trainers are, in reality, simply multiple choice quizzes. Although not as passive as simply looking at a solution, learning through trainers can be inefficient as well, because you can get an answer right without knowing why. In fact, you can put a monkey in front of a multiple choice test and he will randomly get some answers right. And oftentimes in GTO, more than one or even all the choices are actually correct. Furthermore, learning how to play a single hand in isolation doesn't develop the specific ability to construct a holistic, well-balanced strategy, which is critically important. And if you don't have a sense of how a range as a whole is being constructed, the lessons you learn from a trainer can actually lead you in the wrong direction. For example, a particular combo on the river may check 100% of the time, and that same combo but with a different suit may bet 100% of the time, and this is due to how the ranges specifically matched up on a particular board given the action on prior streets. If the user tries to rotely extrapolate what he sees in this type of spot to another situation where the ranges and suits are different, it could result in a large error. Trainers can also cause users to lean towards playing passively. Since GTO strategies are often mixed, and one of the mixed actions will often be to check or call, to avoid making errors, users may become conditioned to favoring passive lines. Whereas if you play aggressively against a solver, you are much more likely to make mistakes, including by not choosing the right sizings, which is a very common error even among the best players in the world. And so given that range construction is the most important skill in poker, and there are no tools that currently exist which directly train it, we decided to go ahead and create our own. Today we're pleased to announce a new module within GTO Check which can be used to practice actually constructing an entire range combo by combo. To show how this tool works, we're going to review a recent hand played by Ariel where she opened the button with 7-6 of clubs and the big blind called. The flop came ace queen 9 with 2 clubs and Ariel c-bet quarter pot. Villain raised 4.6x and Ariel called. The turn was the 8 of diamonds, and Villain continued with an 80% pot bet, and Ariel called again. The river was the 9 of clubs, Villain checked, Ariel bet 75%, and Villain shoved. So to analyze this hand in range constructor mode, we followed the exact same procedure that we use when running any sim. We copy the hand history, paste it into the app, and then analyze. And after the hand is done solving in the cloud, we have the standard option to open the solve in the customary GTO Check dashboard, and we also have this new option to open the solve in range constructor mode. So what we're looking at here is the very first node of this hand, which is the big blind's flop decision. Just like any other solver, we have the large 13x13 grid, which shows all the possible combos in Villain's range as indicated by the white lettering. But unlike other solvers, this grid is completely blank. The idea is that instead of just passively glossing over the strategy, the user is going to be forced to actively evaluate how the range should be played by constructing it himself. The user can add combos that he thinks takes a particular action by manipulating the bar charts, grid, and temporary hand table, and then he can test his guess against the actual solution. So for example, in this case, the big blind's out of position and the board is much more favorable to the pre-flop aggressor who has aces, queens, nines, ace queen, ace 9, ace king, etc. And the big blind has a much lower percentage of these nuttish hands. So I'm going to guess that the entire range checks. So I'm going to simply press the select all button, which populates the grid and the temporary table with all the hands in the big blind's range. And then I'm going to press this button to add all of these combos to our final selection to test against the solution using this action table. Notice that we have a slider here, which is the same slider that exists in the traditional GTO check dashboard, which we can use to limit our test to hands that take an action at a certain threshold percentage. Since oftentimes hands will take some actions a tiny fraction of the time, I would recommend at a minimum to move this slider to 10%, which means that we're going to test our selections against the combos in this sim that check at least 10% of the time. So I've moved my slider over to 10, and now I'll press check. You'll notice that these boxes at the bottom of the dashboard have now changed. These metrics measure how accurate my guess was against the actual GTO solution. So in this case, I correctly guessed 100% of the combos that check in this spot at least 10% of the time, and I also captured 100% of the maximum EV for each of the hands I selected with my guess. Now let's move on to the next node, which is Ariel's decision on the button. So here, Ariel bet quarter pot, and given the sizing, I'm guessing that she's just betting range here. So let's select the entire range again, move our slider to 10, and click bet quarter pot. So here we see that the result is quite different from the last node. Our accuracy is 0%, which means that there is no cluster of combos that bet quarter pot at least 10% of the time. However, the EV accuracy is still relatively high, which means that for each combo that we selected, in this case the whole range, the difference in EV between betting quarter pot and the action with the highest EV is relatively small. In a way, you could think of the combo accuracy as testing whether our frequencies are good, and the EV accuracy as testing whether our specific strategy results in major errors. Also, we see that the grid has changed. For each hand that we guessed incorrectly, the applicable cell has changed to show us what the actual GTO frequencies look like. As we can see, the solver much rather prefers betting large or checking in this spot. This makes sense when we consider the board texture. Ace-King, Ace-Queen, and Ace-Jack non-monotone boards, button versus big blind in a single raise pot, will often result in a polarized betting strategy because both players will have plenty of Ace-X, broadways, and straight draws, but the pre-flop aggressor has a massive advantage when it comes to nuttiest hands. As such, a good portion of the pre-flop aggressor's range is dominating the pre-flop caller's range and wants to accelerate growing the pot. On the other hand, a good portion of the pre-flop aggressor's range is behind the numerous Ace-X combos in the big blind's range, so these hands tend to want to pot control. So let's reset and start again. Since we're analyzing this hand from Ariel's perspective, we're going to make things a bit easier to be more user-friendly and digestible for a beginner. The first thing we're going to do is move our weight slider to 4. This eliminates any combos which have a very low probability of being in the range. This makes combo selection a bit easier because we don't have to worry about combos with very low weight, which will often take unusual lines. Next, we're going to click on this percentage header, which reveals the average frequencies of the GTO solution, giving us a hint of how the range is constructed overall. So with these overall buckets in mind, what I would recommend for beginners is to start out with baby steps. That is, do not try to recreate the entire range. Even for an expert, this is a tall order. Instead, I would suggest implementing what I refer to as the rule of 3. In the context of betting or raising, the rule of 3 means that in addition to our particular holding, we want to think of at least 3 other combos in our range that can play the same way. And at least one of those combos needs to be a value or protection bet, and at least one of those combos needs to be a bluff. And then we also need to think of 3 combos in villain's range that these hands are targeting. So what is the purpose of this rule of 3? Well, first off, we want to think of other combos in our range that can play the same way because this helps disguise our strategies, which is critically important in a game of imperfect information. If we only take a specific action with one type of hand, our play becomes face up. In contrast, if you've ever played against a loose maniac before, you'd know that even if that player is losing overall, he can be incredibly difficult to play against. This is because it's virtually impossible to gauge his specific cards. At any given time, he can show up with random bullshit, which makes developing precise counter strategies very difficult. So although we don't want to be as loose as a maniac, this same principle of disguising our range and strategies is still important for purposes of information hiding. To draw an analogy, think of the possible hands in your range as trees in a forest. The more trees there are in that forest, the more obscure your specific holding becomes to your opponent's perception, which in turn makes you harder to play against. And the reason why we want to target at least 3 combos in the opponent's range is because we don't know his specific cards either. So rational decisions require an assessment of probabilities. Our goal is to maximize our expected value against the most likely hands in villain's range. And the more accurate we're able to assess what those likely hands are, the more precise our counter strategies will be. So let's test out this rule of 3 in this spot. In this case, since the overall strategy is polarizing, it should mean that our strongest hands will want to go into the betting bucket, such as queens and ace-jack. And the primary target for these hands are weaker combos in villain's range that can call, such as weaker ace-x, some queen-x, and flush draws. And on the bluff side, since there are 2 clubs out there, one of our best candidates to bet will be our flush draws, which would benefit significantly from getting hands like lower pocket pairs, king-x, and some weaker queen-x to fold. So now that we've selected our hands, let's test it against a 100% pot bet. And we see that the heat map has now changed. The combos we selected, queens, ace-jack, and the flush draws, remain orange, which means that these hands were guessed correctly. And a bunch of other combos have appeared, which are the hands we did not guess correctly, and this is also reflected in the combo accuracy, which is low, because we missed many combos that also bet pot at least 10% of the time. But as a beginner, this low accuracy number is okay and is to be expected. Remember, baby steps. Not even the best player in the world will be able to select all of these combos correctly. So we're going to start out by just trying to get 3 combos right, and then when we get more experience, we'll expand our rule of 3 to 4, and then to 5, and so on and so forth. Our goal, through diligent practice, is to eventually recreate as much of the range as possible, because the more combos we're able to identify, the more EV we'll be able to capture from the GTO solution. So in this case, Ariel's specific hand, 7-6 of clubs, preferred a large bet or a check, but it does make this small bet at a low frequency, so we're just going to continue along on this branch of the game tree. Facing Ariel's small bet, villain raises 4.6x. So let's try to construct his raising range. Well, we know that a raise is predominantly a polarizing action, so on the value side, this likely includes pocket 9s for the set, and some 2-pair combos, particularly ace-9 and queen-9. These hands want to extract max value from ace-x combos, some lower pairs, and some draws that could be in Ariel's range. And in terms of bluffs, villain's range likely would include some flush draws and straight draws that can fold out queen-x, 9x, and king-x type hands that are likely in Ariel's small c-betting range. So what did we miss? Well, the solver also throws in a few raises with medium strength hands at a lower frequency, and some of the weaker flush draws appear to just want to preserve their equity instead of taking the more aggressive route. As you can probably imagine, when we actively analyze a hand in this way, eventually we'll be able to see patterns emerge with respect to certain hands that we're getting wrong over and over and over again. This in turn will give us insights into potential leaks in our game, as well as potential plus EV moves that we can add to our arsenal. Putting aside the possibility of 3-betting for purposes of simplicity, facing a call or fold decision, we're going to again use the rule of 3 to help guide our decision. But in this type of call-fold scenario, we're going to think of the 3 best bluff catchers in our range. If our hand is in that group, in most situations we're just going to call. If our hand is outside that group, we can consider folding. As we've discussed in previous videos, the best bluff catchers typically have showdown value that beat villain's bluffs, and or have the possibility of drawing ahead of villain's value. So first off, we're going to add all of our ace-x to calls, since these hands are clearly ahead of all the bluffs in villain's range, but likely behind most of villain's value. Next, let's add in some queen-x, but I don't think we can call with all of our second pairs, so let's only add in queen-x with the backdoor flush draw. Finally, let's add in our combo draws and flush draws, which can leap ahead of all of villain's current value. So what did we miss? Well, the solver calls even weaker pairs with the backdoor flush draw, and also calls with all straight draws, which makes some sense given how wide the ranges are and how many bluffs villain can have. Again, as a beginner, we're not going to be too worried about the fact that we missed some hands. The main goal is to first think of the best candidates to call with, and then gradually we can build out our defending range over time. The turn is the 8 of diamonds, and villain barrels with a 80% pot bet. So let's move our slider to 4 to remove the very obscure combos in villain's range. Let's also get a hint by looking at the overall frequencies, which show that this 80% pot bet is a good one used with high frequency. So what does villain's betting range look like? Well, this turn completes the Jack 10 straight, which definitely could be in villain's range as a bluff on the flop. So let's add in those combos. Two pairs such as Ace 9 and Queen 9 could probably also barrel here, getting value from the Ace Kings, Ace Jacks, Ace 10s and the like in Ariel's range. And on the bluff side, he could probably barrel with a lot of his flush draws that want to fold out some sticky under pairs and straight draws, so let's add those as well. And since we see that the solver predominantly uses both this sizing and the 100% pot sizing, which are relatively close to each other, this time we're going to select both of these actions, which functions as an OR, meaning that we're going to test our selections against the GTO hands that bet 80% or 100% at least 10% of the time. And we see that we did a pretty good job of capturing some of the most prominent combos in this betting range, but we missed pocket nines for the set, which makes sense, and a few weaker draws in the form of the gut shot, particularly those that have a pair. Facing this bet, since we've just established that villain's value combos are probably 2-pair or better, all of our top pairs and below are going to be mere bluff catchers, which means that we probably can't call all of them with 100% frequency. So let's call all of our top pairs that also have a gut shot, since these combos both beat villain's bluffs and can also pull ahead of his value. For the same reasoning, let's also add in our second pairs that have a straight draw. And finally, let's add in our highest equity draws that can pull ahead of all of villain's value, our combo draws, our nut flush draws, and our flush draws that also have a pair. Now let's once again test our guess, and we see that we've captured most of the combos that defend this bet. The river is the 9 of clubs and villain checks, so what does his checking range look like? Well, with the flush coming in, it's very likely that he will check his straights that beat the pairs in our range, but of course are behind our flushes. Given that villain is out of position, it's also possible he has some traps in his range, including maybe something like Ace 9, which blocks a lot of our calling range. And then maybe he has some give-ups like King Jack or King 10 that block some of our folding range. As it turns out, the solver actually bluffs all of its total air as it continues its polarizing strategy with a relatively high betting frequency, with the flush coming in on the river. The straights do check, but the remainder of the solver's checking range are trips and weaker pairs, which are probably less likely to be in a human's check raising and barreling line, although Ace Queen is definitely a possibility. The solver also throws in a few checks with flushes, particularly the weaker ones. So facing this check, we need to decide whether to just check back or to bet with our weak flush. And to determine this, we're going to again use our rule of 3. On the betting side, if we can't think of at least 3 combos in villain's range that are weaker and that are likely to call, then there's probably no point to bet. Of the remaining combos in villain's range, he could possibly call with the straight, or Ace Queen, or lower flushes, which gives some merit to betting. But on the other hand, checking would save us some chips if we're up against his traps or stronger flushes. So ultimately, this decision really rests on how frequently we think villain is slow playing here, and whether he's capable of calling with non-flushes given the line and runout. It seems pretty close, so let's try adding our full houses, which are clear bets, and also our flushes. And on the bluff side, given that the flushes come in, a simple way to structure our bluffs is to just fire with all of our weakest hands that have a club. And since we have very little air in this line, these bluffs will likely include some weaker pairs. And we do see that most of the flushes bet, but only the nut flush bets most of the time. And then villain shoves. Based on the range we constructed for villain, we know that it's possible that he could have some slow plays here, with Ace 9 being the most likely candidate. Shoving a flush also seems possible, albeit a bit thin given the prior action and the paired board, especially since Ariel definitely could have some slow plays as well, including aces and queens. And what about villain's bluffs? Well, if he's shoving flushes here, then maybe something like King Jack or King 10 with a club is possible. Otherwise, from a theory perspective, the bluffs would likely be coming from marginal paired hands that block full houses. Ace Queen would seem to be an okay bluffing candidate in theory, since it's behind our value and it blocks aces, queens, and Ace 9. And then maybe something like 9-10 or 9-Jack with one club, which turned a straight draw, might, for similar reasons, be turned into bluffs. Now probably most players at 10-0 aren't capable of turning these hands into bluffs, but sometimes bad players bluff random shit as well, which we should account for. So not too surprisingly, all the full houses shove here. The nut flush also shoves, but only a small fraction of the time. And on the bluff side, the solver does bluff with the combos we mentioned, and it also throws in some shoves with ace-x and queen-x, though it's hard to imagine many people in the pool showing up on the river with these types of hands.
That being said, when we analyze the entire range in this way, it gives us insights of how we should adjust our frequencies to account for our unique strategy. For example, if we don't have these types of bluffs in our range, then in order to adequately balance our value, we should probably increase the frequency of the combos we do bluff beyond the GTO frequency. And we can use this final table selection number to help keep our frequencies in check by comparing the percentage of hands that bet or raise in our strategy to the percentage of hands that bet or raise in the GTO solution.
Facing the shove, Ariel calls, and she's shown pocket nines for quads. So the result was bad, but was calling a mistake. Well, let's think about how her calling range should be constructed. I think it's safe to say that we will call with all of our full houses, pocket aces, pocket queens, ace-9, and queen-9. Since villain is essentially not shoving any flushes, everything below that is a bluff catcher. Now, from Ariel's perspective, the way that she's been taught to handle these types of call-fold scenarios is to simply call with her strongest bluff catchers and to fold the rest. So in her mind, she may have thought that a flush is her strongest bluff catcher below a full house, which led to a call. The issue with this way of thinking is that she has just so many flushes in her range, button versus big blind, in a single raise pot. According to this sim, over 45% of her range is comprised of flushes, and as we just discussed, villain is likely to have very few, if any, bluffs in his range. So to avoid overcalling, one way to handle it would be to just randomize and call all flushes at some moderate frequency. Or alternatively, Ariel could just decide to call with all of her nut flushes and then fold the rest. And if we take card removal into account, which Ariel is not considering at this point, given that we established that villain's value range should mostly consist of full houses, particularly queen-9 and ace-9, calling with something like 9-jack or 10-9, which may have been in the range, having turned a straight draw, would seem to make sense. So as it turns out, calling with 7-6 of clubs or any other flush seems to be generally okay according to this sim, but as we surmise, not all flushes can call, so the solver mixes between calling and folding most of them. And then the solver does call with 9x combos, which contain the best blockers to the full house. And the only way we were able to ascertain this was by constructing each player's range on each street, beginning with a flop. Now I'm sure to many of you, this may have seemed like an easy fold, given that the population likely underbluffs check-raising spots on the river, and frankly this is probably right. But even from an exploitative perspective, the ability to construct ranges in this way is still paramount. You just need to adjust the combos in those ranges based on the perceived imbalances of villain. Additionally, at this stage for beginner, we aren't going to be focused on trying to maximize the number of pennies Ariel wins at 10 NL. Rather, the goal is to learn how to play fundamentally sound poker, and a prerequisite to that goal is the ability to construct ranges. And now we finally have a tool that will actually help us develop this vital skill.